Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 12th, where we are viewing an incredibly iconic horror film. And I know we've been saying that all semester long, but Psycho is a film in and of itself. And Alfred Hitchcock is a master director. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how this film is very similar to some of the previous films. It was based on a novel. This one was based on a novel by Robert Bloch, which is very loosely based on the Ed Gein murders. This is also fodder for another horror film from the 1970s, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that our text talks about, but I made a decision not to represent the 1970s with that film, but instead to represent the 1970s with The Exorcist. I'll talk about some of the reasons why when we get to The Exorcist. Now, if you know anything about Ed Gein, these were horrific serial murders that involved cannibalizing women. And you might have noticed a trend over the course of the semester in the films that we've been seeing about violence against female. Now, one of the things you could do is examine that idea if you so wanted to in a final project. And as you know, we talked a little bit in the last couple classes about the final project. So I'm hopeful that at this point in the semester, you're beginning to really think about possibilities as to what you might want to do. I suspect that most of you will do your traditional academic paper, but there certainly is room for more creative approaches. So if you've got an idea, if you want to, let's say, film a horror short, reach out to me and we can talk about possibilities. The idea of Psycho serving as maybe our first modern horror film, I think, is something that is quite valid. In fact, Hitchcock, he was part of the early deification of directors. So, we talk about directors now like Spielberg, and usually they take top billing even over A-list actors. But Hitchcock was known as the father of the modern horror film. As you know, we started this semester with the first horror film, which was German Expressionism. Then we went to the first American horror film, which was Dracula. And now, where we're hitting the 1960s, I think we're going to see much more modern and contemporary films. Even though many of you had indicated that you were surprised at how modern and contemporary cat people felt, I think this is a step above and beyond in terms of psychological examination, and certainly things like symbolism and filming techniques. Hitchcock, if you know anything about the director, loved to put cameos of himself into the film. So, approximately 6 minutes into the film, you will see someone standing outside through a window and he's wearing a cowboy hat. That's Hitchcock, by the way. And the film had a small budget, but it was a commercial success. And there are many ways to examine this film. One of my favorite ways is talking about the psychological horror of the isolated family unit. Now, we talked a little bit about isolation and cat people and the fear of emotional intimacy. But now we're full fledged in the 1960s. We know that in the 1950s, we had a critique of the idea that suburbs could offer safety. And the white flight that resulted from cities into suburbs led to individual family units basically isolating themselves in small homes. Oftentimes, they were very similar, if not identical, to one another. I was just reading a very interesting article actually from The Atlantic, and it was talking about the concept of the nuclear family. And it was arguing that the nuclear family has been a huge social mistake, and that if you think about the origins of humanity, we're meant to live in tribes, in groups of individuals, in larger communities. And what we've done by having nuclear families is that we've become too reliant on too few people. So if even one person in the nuclear family, for whatever reason, is not able to contribute to that family unit, then the family unit falls apart. And of course, this is something that can be debated, but I think that there's a good amount of common sense involved with the idea that a larger group of people can support one another. That old cliche that it takes a village. So I think we were beginning to get to that when we were talking about Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that the idyllic suburbia wouldn't necessarily offer safety from anything or anyone. In fact, the monsters could be our very neighbors. And in this particular film, Psycho, we definitely see a monster in a facade of what seems to be an innocent and harmless individual, Norman Bates. Um, the home has now become a prison, not a refuge. And one of the things that was kind of interesting about this time period is that it would be the heyday of television as well, which many people argued was one of the ways that families could isolate themselves because they would not need to interact with the world because the world would be brought into them through a television screen. And in fact, if we wanted to go back again to our early origins, the television screen could be mimicking the flickering that we might have gathered around in groups in terms of storytelling when we would sit around fires and bonfires and campfires. I've even expanded the possibility of isolation to some of the geopolitical arguments that have been made about the difficulties that are associated with becoming an isolationist nation. So, what we do see in this film, though, is that there are many secrets behind closed doors and no place is safe, not just in the suburbs, but in the shower. And it's one of the reasons why this film is so iconic is because of its shower scene, which was considered a mastery of editing. To this day, audiences will swear when they're watching that shower scene that they see someone who is showering and who is stabbed by a knife, and that the knife is penetrating the skin. But if you were to go through that scene shot by shot, you will see knife, you will see skin, you will see blood, but they never make contact. One of the things that Hitchcock understood, it's one of the things too that we could talk about with both Cat People and on some level Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that less is more, that you suggest. And again, the shower scene merely suggests. It doesn't necessarily show what we think we see. It's our mind that fills that in because our mind can create a much greater horror than anything we can be shown. That scene led to censors and boycotts, and part of it is because of the iconic soundtrack where all you have to do is just hum a few notes, and now everyone says Psycho the shower scene. My own mother-in-law actually saw this film in the theaters when it first came out, and she tells a story about how she was so traumatized by the horror in this film that for a good amount of time afterwards, she needed her husband, my father-in-law, to stand outside of the bathroom while she was showering so that she felt a sense of protection. So this perhaps is one of the reasons why it's labeled as the first modern horror film, is that it really had an ability to frighten. And while certainly some of the films we've seen have been eerie and have been suggestive, I don't know if anything is more frightening than knowing that no place is safe and that seemingly innocuous people can be monsters behind their facade. Basically, what Norman Bates is, spoiler alert here. So if you needed to stop the video, stop it at minute 9. We're back in case you stopped the video. Norman Bates is basically a serial murderer. And in fact, if you know the film Halloween by John Carpenter, which we will be shortly viewing and talking about in class, he was greatly inspired by the film Halloween. But as I was mentioning earlier, what we're going to see is an examination about a female who's victimized and brutalized, lots of anger and hostility towards females, and lots of female imagery, bird being slang for female, which I think might have been something that I had mentioned when we were talking about Cat People. Marion Crane. A crane is obviously a bird. There's references from Norman that she eats like a bird. We know that Norman is taxiderming birds, a little bit of foreshadowing or hinting of what he is doing with his own mother, that basically he has taxidermied his mother in the way that he has done that with the birds surrounding him. The sense of voyeurism, too, I think is one of the more disturbing elements of the film. That obviously Norman is a voyeur, but we are ourselves. It's a brilliant move from Hitchcock to put us into the position of the voyeur. We oftentimes see what the voyeur is seeing, and of course, through watching film or even television, we're kind of voyeurs. And the film begins with an incredibly intimate moment, especially for the time period, which is a sexual interlude. And that's very deliberate that we're seeing something we're not supposed to be seeing. So, TV and film has basically created a nation of voyeurs, and one could argue that any of these voyeurs could become as psychologically distressed as Norman. And I do think, though, this film has some humor to it as well. I personally love the line where, towards the ending of the film, the mother says that, well, you must think I'm fruity as she's being taken into the fruit cellar. And I hope that you've seen the film by this point so that you know the twist. Now, that said, you can definitely get a sense of the age of the film in terms of its very pat explanation at the end about transvestitism. But obviously, they didn't have the psychological understanding that we've got today. Nevertheless, I think what you've got are iconic films. In fact, in 1992, Psycho was included in the US Film Registry. In fact, this is something that we've been talking about over the entire semester, that just about all of these films have been included in the US Film Registry. If you're wondering about Cat People, that was included in the US Film Registry in 1993. It wasn't until the year 2000 that Dracula was included in the US Film Registry. Obviously, we're not going to get Cabinet of Dr. Caligari being a German film, but basically what we're doing is we're viewing films that are viewed by the film registry to be significant. And when you view Psycho, which is a longer film, notice that these films are getting longer and more complex. It's an hour and 49 minutes. And as you know, I've been recommending 3 viewings, and I still am recommending that even with longer films. The first viewing just for plot, the second viewing for analysis, and the third viewing for reflection when you are preparing to write something like a discussion forum response or a journal response. And of course, your discussion forum and your journal might give you some ideas for your final project as well, which I'm hopeful that you are thinking about, because next week is spring break. And I will certainly post on our Moodle site that it's spring break. But after spring break, things tend to move rather quickly. So you definitely want to think about that the semester will be gone in a moment, so to speak, after spring break. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but not exaggerating too much. Psycho, you can find it in a lot of different places: Amazon, YouTube streaming services, DVD, the GCC library, interlibrary loan. As you know, I always try to provide you with free links whenever I can find them online. I was able to find a free link, so you can see that in the notes below in the second section. I don't believe that link has closed captioning, unfortunately, but I was able to find a copy of the screenplay so that if you wanted to read the screenplay, you certainly could, in addition to watching the film. Now, next week, not the week where we would have spring break, but the week following that, our next film is going to be Where I Cheat, because Psycho is supposed to represent the 1960s, certainly the beginning of the 1960s. And Night of the Living Dead represents the ending of the 1960s. And it's a fascinating story of how this film came to be about. Basically, it is in public domain. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why, but that means that it's easier to find online. And I've been trying to provide you with the films a week earlier, particularly if you are going to be engaged in 3 viewings. I was able to find not only a link for Night of the Living Dead, but there's closed captioning involved with it, as well as another copy of the screenplay if you wanted to read along. But I warn you that once we get past Night of the Living Dead, I've usually encountered challenges with finding films from the 70s on. So I'm going to try my best to find links. And certainly, if you find a link that I've been unable to find, please share it with me so I can share that with the class as well. One of the things I wanted you to do, in addition to watching Psycho, is to watch a short documentary entitled The Uncanny. This is in the third section of our notes below, and it's entitled Understanding Psycho. And it gives you a good idea of how one could go about analyzing, from an academic perspective, a film, especially a horror film, which is something that many of you will be doing, especially if you're writing a paper for your final project. It's 12 minutes long, and certainly I'm not expecting something as sophisticated as this from your own final project. This is somebody who's devoted years to analyzing the film Psycho. But in 12 minutes, you can basically get an interesting view of Psycho in relation to the uncanny. Remember, we were talking about Freud's uncanny, that was oftentimes an element in horror film, that which is similar to yet different from reality. So there's a sense of unsettling eeriness associated with it. So do watch that as well, because I think not only will it serve as a model of how you can do an academic analysis, but it'll give you also a different perspective on Psycho itself. So, with that said, I leave you to watching Psycho. And today's attendance question, which would be due on Saturday, and of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. But this would be due on Saturday, the 14th. Why do you think that shower scene, and if you haven't seen Psycho yet, you'll know what I'm talking about after you've seen it. Why do you think the shower scene is so iconic in Psycho? And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you're certainly encouraged to respond to your peers. You are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That should give you a good overview of what we would have talked about in class, and also could give you some ideas for journaling, and more importantly, for the final examination, or for the final project. In terms of the final examination, I'll talk more about it as the semester progresses, but basically it's going to be an open book, open note essay exam where you get to choose an essay question and basically synthesize what we've been talking about over the course of the semester. If this were a face-to-face class, you'd have approximately 2 to 3 hours to complete that exercise. Since we are in a face-to-face situation, you'd have 24 hours to complete that. And really, the best way to prepare for the final, obviously, to have seen all of the films, to have watched all of these class videos, to have read all of the class discussion forum responses and my responses in turn, and to have done all of the journals and read my comments in turn. And all of that is basically what the final exam will ask you to do, is just to find a way to organize it in relation to the essay question. And again, I'll give you some choice. But we'll talk more about the final exam. For now, enjoy Psycho. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And have a good spring break next week. I will post on our Moodle that we're on spring break. And then we will continue on with Night of the Living Dead. Take care. Bye-bye.